In February 1945, three men made a decision that would divide Europe for the next 80 years. Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill, Joseph Stalin. They met in Yalta. They agreed to split the continent, and they built no safeguards to prevent what came next. The date was February 4th, 1945. The location, the Levadia Palace in Yalta, Crimea. Germany was already defeated, not officially but strategically. The Red Army was closing in from the east. Allied forces controlled the west. Berlin would fall within 3 months. The question on the table was not whether Germany would lose, it was what Europe would look like after. Stalin arrived with leverage. Soviet troops occupied Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. The Red Army had done the bulk of the fighting on the Eastern Front. Stalin had paid in blood. Now he expected payment in territory. Roosevelt and Churchill had no troops east of Germany. They had no way to force Stalin out without starting a new war. A war their publics would not support. A war their militaries were not prepared to fight. So they made a choice. They accepted Soviet control over Eastern Europe. In exchange, Stalin promised free elections, democratic governance, respect for national sovereignty. No enforcement mechanisms were written into the agreement. No timelines were set. No inspections were authorized. No military guarantees were provided to ensure compliance. This was the deal. Soviet influence in the East, Western influence in the West, and a promise with no power to back it up. The Yalta Conference ended on February 11, 1945. Within 4 years, every promise Stalin made would be broken. The official language of the Yalta Agreement referenced the Declaration on Liberated Europe. It stated that liberated nations would have the right to create democratic institutions of their own choice through free elections. It stated that the three powers would assist these nations in forming interim governmental authorities broadly representative of all democratic elements. It stated that these interim governments would hold elections as soon as possible. This is what was promised. Here is what was enforced. Poland, a communist-dominated provisional government, was installed in June 1945. Opposition leaders were arrested. Elections held in 1947 were neither free nor fair. Non-communist parties were banned or absorbed. Romania, King Michael was forced to appoint a communist prime minister in March 1945. The monarchy was abolished in 1947. The Romanian Communist Party consolidated total control. Bulgaria, the Fatherland Front, dominated by communists, took power in September 1944. Opposition leaders were executed. Elections in 1946 were heavily manipulated. Hungary, Soviet forces oversaw the installation of a coalition government in 1945. By 1949, the Hungarian Working People's Party held absolute power. Dissent was criminalized. Czechoslovakia, a coalition government lasted until 1948. In February of that year, the Communist Party staged a coup. President Edvard Beneš resigned. Democratic governance ended. East Germany, the Soviet occupation zone, became the German Democratic Republic in 1949. One-party rule was institutionalized. The Berlin Wall would follow in 1961. In every case, the pattern was identical. A brief period of nominal coalition, then consolidation, then elimination of opposition, then single-party control. Stalin had promised elections. He delivered them, but the outcomes were predetermined. The procedures were controlled. The results were never in doubt. Roosevelt and Churchill had accepted Soviet influence. They had not defined its limits. They had not created mechanisms to challenge it. They had not planned for enforcement. They had trusted a promise, and the promise was broken. By 1946, Winston Churchill was no longer prime minister, but he gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri that named what had happened. He said, "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. This was not metaphor. it was description. The border between Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe and the West became militarized. Travel was restricted. Communication was monitored. Families were split. Nations were isolated. In 1947, the United States announced the Truman Doctrine. It committed American resources to containing Soviet expansion. The Marshall Plan followed, rebuilding Western Europe economically and politically. In 1949, NATO was formed. 12 nations signed a collective defense pact. Article 5 stated that an attack on one member would be considered an attack on all. The division of Europe was now formalized. 2 blocs, 2 military alliances, 2 economic systems, 2 ideologies. The Cold War had begun. For 42 years, Europe remained divided. East Germany and West Germany existed as separate states. Berlin was split by a wall. Families lived on opposite sides for decades. Eastern Europe became a network of satellite states. Political decisions were made in Moscow. Dissent was suppressed. Uprisings in Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, and Poland in 1980 were crushed. Western Europe rebuilt under American protection. Democratic governance stabilized. Economic growth resumed. But security depended entirely on NATO and the U.S. nuclear umbrella. The arms race escalated. Thousands of nuclear warheads were deployed across Europe. The doctrine of mutually assured destruction kept the peace, but at the cost of permanent existential risk. Proxy conflicts erupted in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Korea, Vietnam, Afghanistan. The superpowers fought everywhere except directly against each other. Then, in 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. In 1991, the Soviet Union collapsed. The Cold War ended. But the structure it created did not disappear. The Yalta framework did not end in 1991. It adapted. NATO, formed as a response to Soviet expansion, did not dissolve. It expanded. Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic joined in 1999. The Baltic states joined in 2004. By 2020, NATO included 14 former Warsaw Pact or Soviet-aligned states. From a Western perspective, this was the fulfillment of self-determination. These nations chose to join. They sought protection. They wanted integration into the democratic West. From a Russian perspective, this was the continuation of encirclement. NATO, the alliance formed to contain the Soviet Union, was now directly on Russia's borders. The security logic of 1949 was still in effect. The threat had not disappeared, it had moved closer. This is the unresolved consequence of Yalta. The decision to divide Europe into spheres of influence created a security architecture that never fully dissolved. Ukraine is the clearest example. Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union until 1991. It became independent. It maintained ties with Russia, but also sought integration with Europe. In 2014, after Ukraine's government moved closer to the West, Russia annexed Crimea. The same Crimea where Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin met in 1945. In 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine. The justification offered by Moscow centered on NATO expansion, Western encroachment, and the need for a buffer zone between Russia and the West. This language is a direct descendant of Yalta-era logic. Spheres of influence, buffer zones, security guarantees enforced through control of neighboring territory. The actors have changed, the ideologies have evolved, but the framework remains. Europe was divided in 1945 by a decision that prioritized immediate stability over long-term resolution. That division was never fully undone. It was managed, it was adapted, but it was never resolved. And 80 years later, the consequences are still playing out. Yalta was not a betrayal, it was a choice. Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin faced a strategic reality. Soviet forces controlled Eastern Europe. Western forces did not. A new war to reverse this reality was unthinkable. So they chose compromise. Soviet influence in the East, Western influence in the West, and a promise that Stalin would respect democratic principles. They knew Stalin might not keep his word. They hoped he would. They had no mechanism to enforce it if he didn't. The decision divided Europe. It created a security architecture built on mutual suspicion. It institutionalized a fault line that still exists today. This was not inevitable. It was not preordained. It was the result of decisions made by specific people at a specific moment in history. Yalta did not cause every conflict that followed, but it set the pattern. Spheres of influence, buffer zones, security through control. That pattern has outlasted the Cold War. It has outlasted the Soviet Union. It has outlasted the leaders who created it, and it continues to shape Europe today. In February 1945, three men sat in a palace in Crimea and made a deal. They divided Europe. They promised elections. They built no enforcement. 80 years later, the consequences of that decision are still unfolding. History is not a closed chapter. It is an unresolved case, and the verdict is still being written.